What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Dmitri Alperovitch, the co-founder and executive chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, the co-founder of leading cybersecurity company CrowdStrike, and the author of the soon-to-be-released World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. In the first hour of our conversation, Dimitri makes the case that we are already in the midst of a new Cold War, and that Taiwan is the strategic flashpoint that risks triggering a devastating conflict between two nuclear powers in a way that West Berlin nearly played during America's last Cold War with the Soviet Union. We discuss the similarities and differences between Cold Wars I and II, including the role played by the USSR as a liberator in Europe, and the strong appeal of communism as a competing ideology in the early decades of the First Cold War. We also discuss how we lost an opportunity to build a sustainable peace with post-Soviet Russia, and how that has made the new Cold War with China all the more challenging and dangerous. The episode's second hour begins with a discussion about the importance of Taiwan and a thought experiment about what would happen in the event of an uncontested Chinese takeover of the island. We discuss the philosophical underpinnings of American supremacy and arguments for its preservation, the need to build national unity by addressing legitimate political grievances, military-industrial reform, immigration, and what it will take to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that Dimitri believes could happen before the end of this decade. If you want access to that part of the conversation, and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly informative and sobering conversation with my guest, Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri Alperovitch, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
And you're back with a new book, your first book. Congratulations.
Thank you. Maybe first and only. We'll see how it goes.
It's a lot of work. We were just talking about that. I can only imagine. I don't even know how people write books. I mean, first of all, it's a lot of work, period. But while you also have like a full-time job and you got a gazillion other responsibilities to write a book, it's insane.
You know, the biggest challenge I faced is just the stress of the prolonged process to actually publish it, because the book was, for all intents and purposes, locked down back in August, and it's taking, this long to get it out. And I was able to make small changes to it, but, as in pins and needles of if something big happens, if Xi Jinping dies, a lot in the book has to change, and there's not an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I mean, you did update it for October 7th. I don't know how far into the conflict you actually did update it, but you got that in there. So, before we get into the book, the title of the book is World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. We'll get into the book, but real quick, you talk a little bit about your bio in the book, and I don't think you and I have had a chance to actually discuss this on air at all. You immigrated from the Soviet Union when you were in high school, correct? No, not high school. I was a
teenager.
Yeah, teenager. So tell us a little bit about that experience. Like, what's sort of your background?
Yeah, so I was born in the former Soviet Union in Moscow in the 1980s and was able to come over from my family. Ultimately ended up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was an interesting experience, going from Moscow, a city of 10 plus million people, to the Deep South and a city of 150,000. But it was done in the 1990s. So it was after the fall of the Soviet Union, and things were much more relaxed. So this was not sort of the escape from, the communist Soviet Union of the 1970s, as a number of people have done.
Yeah. So how good was your English at that time?
It was pretty good. I had studied it since second grade in Russia. So English was actually not the problem. It was just more of a cultural experience, and particularly of the Deep South, because, the South is different. It's not like the rest of the United States.
So I can only imagine what it was like for you to be arriving at a high school like that, and also for those kids, like how they probably stereotyped you in their head. I mean, did you have a heavy Russian accent? Like, fill us in a little bit on that. Like, what was the cultural experience like for you and for them?
Well, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. So we didn't go straight to the United States because, our immigration system is unfortunately a mess. And we actually initially immigrated to Canada. So I was in Toronto for about a year. And then my dad ended up getting a job in Chattanooga. And that's why we moved there on an H-1B visa for him. And my first day in school in Chattanooga, and in Toronto, was actually pretty easy to assimilate. It's a big city. Again, my English was great, so I didn't have many problems there. But my first day in school in Chattanooga, this kid comes up to me and he says, "Where are you from?" And I sort of hesitate because, if I say Russia or Soviet Union, again, this is the South. It is the 90s, early 90s, but it's still the South. And, we just came out of the Cold War. So, I answer truthfully, but not fully. I say, "I just arrived from Canada." And the guy says, "Where's that?" And I knew that my answer was irrelevant.
Wow. That was probably a good move. So let's move now to the subject of the book. As I mentioned, the title of the book is World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. The book describes a new security paradigm defined by China's rise as an economic, military, and technological power that threatens the power and authority that the United States has amassed since the end of the Cold War and cemented really through the unipolar period. You call this paradigm Cold War II. And before we discuss the term Cold War II, why you chose it, and whether or not it's appropriate, I'm curious to understand your perspective on how we got here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been passionate about this issue for well over a decade now. In fact, my first exposure to the fight with the PRC was actually in 2010 when I was in the field of cybersecurity at the time. And I got a call from this company you may have heard of called Google. And they had just been infiltrated by China, and they were asking me to work with them on this investigation, which I ended up naming Operation Aurora, actually named for the Russian battleship of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution that fired the shot that was a signal to Lenin to launch the revolution. And that was often called the shot heard around the world, the shot that changed history, the course of the 20th century. And I felt very strongly at the time that this was the first time that you had seen a nation state like China infiltrate American companies, steal intellectual property. At least it was something that was first revealed in our investigation. As we learned later, it actually had been going on for many years. We were ignoring that, and that it was a dramatic moment. It certainly changed the course of my life and my career, and I think of the entire cybersecurity industry, and really set us on the path of acknowledging that China is not on a path to being a friend, that it is an adversary. It took several years for the Obama administration to finally get to that acknowledgement publicly. And then, of course, the Trump administration picked it up and took it further. And the Biden administration has largely adopted Trump administration's policies on China. But the appreciation that we were in a pretty existential fight I've had for a while. But as I write in the book, the Cold War term, I think, is the only one that is appropriate. In fact, what we have between the United States and China literally is the dictionary definition of a Cold War. Literally, I can tell you the definition from just the Oxford Dictionary is that a Cold War is a state of political hostility between countries that is characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of warfare, open warfare. I mean, I would challenge any of your listeners to tell me that that is not the exact definition of the state of relationships between our two countries right now. But beyond that, we go through the history of Cold War I, as I call it, the Cold War, and compare and contrast to what's going on today in China. And I was actually struck doing the deep research for this book of how almost identical the two conflicts are on just every single part of that competition that defined the first Cold War, whether it's the global competition for supremacy between the two nations, whether it's the arms race, right? We're in a nuclear arms race. We're in a conventional arms race. We're in a space war and a space race that characterized, of course, the 1960s. We are both preparing for war over a flashpoint, a regional flashpoint. In the first Cold War, it was West Berlin and a little bit of Cuba, and today it's Taiwan. We have an ideological struggle. It's not communism versus capitalism, but it's authoritarianism versus democracy. In fact, President Biden even acknowledges that, even though he won't accept the term Cold War. We have a scramble for military bases in the region. We're deploying bases now once again on the Philippines, expanding our presence in Japan and on our territories in Guam. And the Chinese are doing the same with Pakistan, with Cambodia, with Djibouti. So on almost every level, we are in the struggle. And even on economic dependence, as I write in the book, a lot of people make this argument that we can't possibly be in a Cold War with China because of all this trade that goes on, and we didn't have that in the Soviet Union. And I actually debunk that. Certainly the magnitude of trade with China is, off the charts in terms of a scale and far exceeds anything we had with the Soviet Union. But there was quite a bit of trade with the Soviet Union, and very important trade for them in particular, because as I write in the book, virtually the entire oil and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry of the Soviet Union that financed the regime, that financed the arms race, that financed the guerrilla movements, communist guerrilla movements that they were sponsoring around the world, was running off technology, Western technology that was sold to them, right? I write about how we had sold them key components for weapon systems throughout the Cold War, how the Europeans provided loans to sustain the regime in exchange for oil and gas, in exchange for wheat that was being exported. So not on the same level as China, but there was quite a bit of trade and dependence that existed even throughout the Cold War. So the two conflicts are very, very similar. And the reason I call it Cold War II, and it's Roman numeral II, not 2.0, this is not a continuation of the first one. It's a different conflict entirely. But it is, in a way, sort of like World War I and World War II. Different conflicts, different parties involved, different causes of it. But they're both world wars, and these are both Cold Wars, and both great Cold Wars. So, the first one is Roman numeral I. The second one is Roman numeral II.
Those are great points, and I want to delve into some of them in more detail. And I also want to draw out some of the distinctions between the first Cold War and what you call the second Cold War, and get your thoughts on that. Before we do that, one more question on how we got here. So looking back, was it the euphoria of the 1990s was it primarily that, just the vibes, so to speak, of that decade that led us to believe that the Chinese would become more like us and that they would feel comfortable in a position of subordination to American power?
I think it goes further than that. Probably defining moment of the relationship is actually Tiananmen Square, was 1989, right? So as the Soviet Union was falling apart, as the Berlin Wall was coming down later that year, you had this confrontation with the students in Beijing, and the Chinese regime, unlike the regimes in Eastern Europe, chose to brutally suppress it and kill untold number of people. Perhaps we'll never even know the full death toll there. And there was a momentary sort of shock in America of, oh my God, maybe we got these people wrong. But it lasted all of 5 seconds, right? We stopped selling them weapons, which we were doing throughout the 1980s. Just remarkable that we were actually selling Black Hawk helicopters and other weapons platforms to China that they promptly reverse engineered and produced indigenous copies of, which are creating enormous problems for us now in the Indo-Pacific. So we stopped doing that, but we basically continued fully trading with them through the 1990s and 2000s, ignoring the fact that this is a country that had no intention of liberalizing, had no intention of really tamping down its anti-Americanism, which was latent but always there. And, I write in the book that we also got the start of the Cold War I wrong because, many people think it started sort of in 1945, right as the Second World War ended, or, 1946 with the famous speech by Churchill in Fulton, Missouri, talking about an iron curtain that has descended on Eastern Europe. And as I write in the book, I actually think that's wrong. I think the first Cold War began in 1920 as the first hot war between the United States and Russia ended. A lot of Americans don't know this or have forgotten, but we actually fought a war with Russia where we sent American troops for the end of the First World War into Siberia, into the Far East, to intervene in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks and try to help the white forces. Ultimately failed, of course. The Bolsheviks won. We left, promptly forgot about that conflict in which almost 500 American soldiers have perished in Russia. And the Russians didn't. And I quote their writings at the time saying that the lesson they took away from that intervention is that they're in an existential conflict with the capitalist West, and they had to fight to the death. And they started building their military forces, their economy for that fight. And what did? We started trading with them. We started to have American and British and German industrialists going over to the Soviet Union, providing the intellectual property, building factories, the Volga limousines that the Soviet leadership would drive in the parades on Red Square that, everyone had seen videos of, where they would inspect the troops and the military systems. Those Volga limousines came out of a factory that was built by, who? Henry Ford, who came over to the Soviet Union, built initially a tractor factory. Later, that was expanded to an automobile factory, nationalized by the Soviets, of course. The steel plant in Mariupol, we've talked a lot about the war in Ukraine, the Azovstal steel facility, this enormous steel facility that was the last holdout for Ukrainian forces before they were overrun by the Russians in Mariupol in the start of the war. That was an exact copy of a steel plant in Gary, Indiana, that was basically brought over by American industrials to build in the Soviet Union to help Stalin industrialize this country. And there were so many numerous examples of that where we were at literally helping their economy throughout the 1920s, 1930s, at the same time as they were doing what? Stealing intellectual property, not through cyber, of course. Cyber didn't exist, but through traditional means. The Chinese scaled that up massively, of course, including in cyber. But the similarities between the two conflicts are numerous. And just as in the first Cold War, I believe the second Cold War started a lot earlier than we realized. It didn't start with the Trump tariff war of 2017, 2018. It began much earlier, I think in potentially 70s, 80s. It could be even earlier, where the Chinese, you look at their writings, were focused on this conflict, were focused on taking Taiwan. And we really ignored it and pretended that the problem didn't exist. And now the chickens are coming to roost.
So is strategic ambiguity an example of an expedient policy solution that's now coming back to bite us? The decision to try and walk a middle path between...
So strategic ambiguity is interesting. And I write about this episode in the 1970s, which I think is widely misunderstood. This whole Nixon-Kissinger opening up China that some China hawks believe was a mistake. Some people believe that it was a phenomenal move against the Soviet Union. I think that whole episode is widely misunderstood because what happened there, and I think it was the right move by Nixon and Kissinger, is they went over to China. They came up with this concept of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan, this phrasing that we use to this day of the one China policy, which means that we acknowledge, and we use the word acknowledge, we do not accept, we do not recognize, but we acknowledge that people in Taiwan and China believe there is one China. That is it. That is our entire policy, and which does not recognize that Taiwan is a part of China or China is a part of Taiwan, as was for many years the feeling on Taiwan. It just acknowledges that there are people that feel that way, right? So it was brilliant phrasing that gave the Chinese a pretense that we support their position, when in reality we did nothing of the sort, right? And what we got out of that statement is the Soviet Union getting deeply scared by this, growing alignment between the United States and China in 1972, which Kissinger very brilliantly leveraged immediately. Almost as soon as he left Beijing, what did he do? He turned around and flew to Moscow to meet with Brezhnev and to strike a détente deal with the Soviet Union. Mao, in fact, was livid. He thought he was completely snookered by Kissinger. He talked about how this is a duplicitous man that can't be trusted. So funny because now, of course, he's been heralded as this great friend of China. But at the time, Mao was absolutely astonished that he would be betrayed in this way, where he thought that they were building a partnership with America against the Soviet Union. China had just fought a border conflict with the Soviet Union in 1969. And what does Kissinger do? He leverages that and improves the relationship with the Soviet Union and doesn't actually pay China anything. This is the mistake that people make, that China was not opened up by Nixon and Kissinger. It was not recognized. The trade did not open. We did not withdraw from Taiwan until 1979, which was not Kissinger and Nixon. It was Carter and Brzezinski that decided to pay for the, improved relationship with China that Kissinger and Nixon secured, pay years later, 7 years later. Kissinger, throughout his time, both in the Nixon administration and the Ford administration, kept pushing the Chinese off because they kept saying, well, when are you going to withdraw from Taiwan? When are you going to recognize us? And he was like, just wait. We'll get to it, right? And Brzezinski and Carter come in and they say, why don't we pay them? Even though we've already secured the price, which was the detente with the Soviet Union, why don't we open up China, withdraw from Taiwan, recognize China, and we are where we are today because of that fateful decision, for which we really, except for the economic benefit, and I don't want to underestimate them, they were certainly significant to our economy, but from a national security perspective, we paid a huge price for it. We really got nothing for it because by that point in 1979, the Soviet Union and China were already reconciling. So that period of tensions was diminishing. In fact, a few years later, under Gorbachev, they would already start to rebuild their relationships to a great extent. And detente was failing because Soviet Union at that point invaded Afghanistan. So the whole landscape was changing from what it was like in 1972 that Kissinger and Nixon leveraged. And I think it was a huge mistake by Carter and Brzezinski to actually open up China, withdraw from Taiwan. And in fact, most of our problems, we can talk about this, with regards to Taiwan's defense stem from that critical decision of 1979.
What's interesting is that Carter and Brzezinski also armed the Mujahideen, which came back to bite the Americans. I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, but
that was more under Reagan, in fairness, but yes.
Well, what's interesting about that is it brings up 9/11. So to bring it back to how we got here, the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, Bush W, the son, came into office with an intention to focus on China. And like is often the case, intentions are assaulted by reality. You get punched in the face, your game plan goes out, you change. How important was 9/11 in determining where we are today? And how do you think American foreign policy would have been different and are the challenges that we would face today would be different had that not occurred?
Yeah, the counterfactuals are always really hard, right? We don't know what path history would have taken, but we do have some indications. And people have forgotten this, but just as President Bush, the junior, came into office, we had an enormous confrontation with China, right? They shot down effectively, well, didn't shoot down, but basically forced down one of our spy planes in international waters that landed on Hainan Island in China, where they basically held the crew hostage and took all the equipment from that plane, reverse engineered it later on, which was a big problem. So we had this incredible tension with China in April of 2021, months before 9/11, of course. And it ultimately got resolved. But, there was a lot of sort of anti-China feeling coming into the Bush administration that was completely put on the back burner as 9/11 occurred and preoccupied us for the next 15 years plus as we pursued this war on terrorists. So I do think that, 9/11 absolutely distracted us. I mean, it was obviously a huge conflict and we had to respond to it, but we dropped our eye of the ball. I think there was a feeling under the Bush administration that we were all now, the whole world was now united against terrorism. It was an attempt, of course, to mend the relationships with Russia. He famously said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. And the same thing was happening with China. And they got both of these wrong.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Russia, because I've always felt, at least as far back as the debate that Romney had with Obama when Romney identified Russia as being our number one strategic enemy. I've long felt that we lost an opportunity to build a sustainable peace with post-Soviet Russia. Now, maybe that's, again, kind of biased looking back, and that in fact the same logic about an inevitable break with China would hold for Russia because of the size of the country, because of the deep sense of nationalism and place, something that you talk about in the book. I'm curious sort of how you see this. To what degree are American foreign policy makers responsible? Obviously, they're not as responsible as the everything is America's fault people try to make it out to be, but how responsible are American foreign policymakers for the situation that we find ourselves in with Russia today, which I feel like didn't have to be the case, and we could have had a much more constructive relationship that actually would help the larger framing of America's pivot towards Asia and the focus on China?
I think there was always an inevitable conflict between our values and our interests with regards to Russia. Here's the fundamental issue. I actually believe, and I write in the book, that Putin did not set out to be this anti-Western, anti-Americanist that he is today. I actually think that during the early years of the Bush administration, the late period under Clinton, when he had just taken power, he was interested in better relationships with the United States, with Europe, on his terms. So he was actually the first leader to call Bush after 9/11 to express his condolences and to actually provide assistance to us in Afghanistan. They provided us maps from the Soviet era of Afghanistan, which we really had very limited intelligence on. They provided us with a route to supply our forces through Central Asia. If it weren't for them, that would have been, particularly in the early days, very, very difficult for us. But what he thought he would gain from providing that help is for basically the United States to butt out of what is viewed as his region. Ukraine, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and that he would basically be allowed to do whatever he wanted in his sphere of influence. And he was shocked in 2004 when the Ukrainians revolted against the corrupt election of a pro-Russian candidate in 2004 and launched the first revolution, the Orange Revolution, that brought in the Yushchenko government that was more pro-Western. He was convinced that that was a CIA plot, that this was Western interference in his near abroad, which of course was not the case. But we rhetorically certainly supported the pro-democratic movement in Ukraine, gave Ukrainians, the new Ukrainian president, a platform in the United States. He came over to see Bush and the like. Putin saw that all as anti-Russian moves. And, you could say that was a mistake, but, it was also consistent with our values where we are supporting self-determination of free people to choose their own leadership. We are anti-corruption. So I do think that it was always inevitable that we would face that confrontation of values versus interests. Maybe you could say sort of in the Kissinger realpolitik mindset that, Ukraine didn't matter, that the Caucasus didn't matter, Central Asia didn't matter, leave them all to be, controlled and occupied by Russia, and we'll focus on other areas. I think it's inconsistent with our values and not really realistic in today's foreign policy. I don't think there's appetite among Republicans or Democrats to do something like that. So I think that Russia was never ours to win because Putin was always determined, not necessarily on world domination, confrontation with the West, but domination of his near abroad and reconstitution of the Russian Empire. And that was always going to bring us into a conflict like this.
So I don't want to get stuck on this point, but I guess it depends on how you want to define meddling by the United States, because it's not like we have a Department of Meddling and there's a clearly defined paper trail of what's going on. The U.S. uses NGOs, uses private consultants as part of influence operations in other countries. Other countries are doing it to us. We're doing it to them. So I do think that played some role in this. But what I feel like is sort of missed here, and then we'll move past Russia and get into comparison of the modern Cold War, is, Putin put that essay out the summer before he invaded Ukraine, right? What was the title of that essay again? On the something larger Russia and
the
Ukraine.
historical.
And he also did an interview with Tucker Carlson recently. And what's interesting, and I'm someone who, before the invasion of Ukraine, had done episodes with folks like my former professor of Soviet history, Stephen Cohen, with John Mearsheimer, who became more popular after the invasion, and was critical about some aspects of American foreign policy. I was familiar with George Kennan's warnings after the fall of the Soviet Union about NATO expansion. And yet, what's interesting for me is that I've almost come to the opposite conclusion, which is that I feel like I've seen more evidence to suggest that this was not about NATO. And in fact, Putin had two great opportunities to make the point. And he hardly mentions NATO in his interview with Tucker.
It was interesting because Tucker kept asking him about it and he kept ignoring it, right?
He kept ignoring it.
I do think, I think it's more nuanced than that. I think the Mearsheimer view, which I fundamentally disagree with, that was only about NATO expansion is wrong. But the view of the other side that NATO expansion had nothing to do with it is also wrong. I think it contributed. I write in the book that there are 5 reasons why I became convinced, and we had the conversation on the podcast back in that time, in December of 2021, 3 months before this war, that Putin was going to launch this invasion before the end of that winter. And those 5 reasons had to do with, first and foremost, history. His distorted view of history that Ukraine was never a country, always belonged to Russia. And he went on for like 40 minutes with Tucker Carlson talking about that. Clearly motivating factor. Second was destiny. He felt that it was his destiny and Russia's destiny to rebuild the old Russian Empire, not necessarily the Soviet Union, but the old Russian Empire. And that there was an ego reason as well, because he wanted to do it on his watch. It was very clear. The reason why the war was launched when it was is because he was turning 70. He was starting to think about his own mortality, initially at least succession of power. And he wanted to have this accomplishment for his legacy, right? He didn't want someone else to do it. He wanted him to do it and go into the history books as the new Peter the Great that rebuilt at least part of the Russian Empire. But there was also reasons of security and geography, which can't be ignored, right? Wars aren't started for usually a single reason. There's a multitude of reasons that go into it. And security and geography do play a role. The Russians have always been concerned about NATO expansion, going back to Yeltsin's times. It's not just a Putin thing. And we can talk till we're blue in the face that NATO is a defensive alliance, but they certainly don't view it that way. And, they look at Kosovo.
They've engaged in offensive operations after the end of the Cold War in 9/11.
Exactly. Well, Kosovo is probably the most clear example of that. But also geography. Ukraine has always been looked at as a buffer state by Russia. Perhaps you could argue unfairly because, it's not their state to be a buffer. But nevertheless, throughout history, Russia has experienced numerous invasions from Europe, Hitler, Teutonic Knights, Napoleon, Poles, and many of them have gone through Ukraine to reach Moscow. And the distances between Eastern Ukraine and Moscow are not very, very long. In fact, we got an example of that just last year with the Prigozhin mutiny, right? Where Wagner and Prigozhin left their training camps in Eastern Ukraine, in occupied Ukraine, and traveled to Moscow. And within about half a day were on the outskirts of Moscow, right? That is not something that the Russians do not pay any attention to, how short those distances are. And in fact, you have drones from Ukraine reaching Moscow now on a regular basis. So they're acutely aware of that vulnerability. Again, I do not believe it is a singular reason. I don't believe it's even the most important reason. I think the history and destiny and ego played a bigger role. But to say that it had no role whatsoever is incorrect as well.
What was Prigozhin thinking when he did that? I mean, do we have some idea? Is there a firm conclusion now about what that was ultimately about? And because it eventually led to his demise. He crashed in a not so coincident plane crash with some other Wagner forces not too long after that.
Yeah, I wrote a piece on this in Foreign Policy of what caused his death, which I actually don't think was a direct consequences of the mutiny, obviously followed from the mutiny. Look, the mutiny was all about trying to pressure Putin to replace Shoigu and Gerasimov. It was a very tactical thing. He got increasingly upset that Wagner was getting marginalized in this war that he felt, probably rightly, he had contributed enormously to. He took Bakhmut at great cost to the Wagner troops. They lost tens of thousands of people in that fight, in these incredibly reckless and insane waves of prisoners that were being thrown against Ukrainian fire and artillery. And, he was getting starved of shells and his empire was getting muscled in on in Africa. So it was both a wartime decision-making that he was opposed to, but also the conflict with Shoigu that he's had for years now about the business conflicts that they've had. And this was an attempt to try to pressure Putin to get rid of these two guys. And it was a really dumb decision because he, I think, felt he was way more powerful than he really was. And as we saw, Putin's reaction was the exact opposite. Shoigu and Gerasimov still there, and Prigozhin is no longer with us. But I do think that his death was not a direct consequence of the mutiny. I actually do think that Putin pardoned him. He did not view him in the same way that he viewed, for example, Navalny or other opponents of the regime. He understood that this was not a coup, that this was not an attempt to displace him. He still felt incredibly offended, incredibly angry that someone would confront him this way and try to pressure him in this outrageous way. But I do think that he pardoned him. I do think that there was a price for that pardon, which is that now anything that's yours is going to be mine. And you are going to lose your empire in Africa. You are going to lose Wagner. I'm going to take it all away from you. You can keep your miserable life and go sip mojitos, in Jamaica or the Maldives, but you're done. And Prigozhin did not get that message, right? So for 2 months, he met with Putin. He was traveling around St. Petersburg, being very public as opposed to kind of disappearing into the ether. He kept putting out videos. And most importantly, he kept resisting the GRU takeover of the Wagner businesses and militias in Africa, where the mining interests and the support of various dictators in Africa that Wagner was involved in, the GRU was basically attempting to take over and telling these leaders in Africa that we are now going to be doing business directly. You don't need to deal with Prigozhin. And literally, as soon as they would leave, Prigozhin would fly in and say, no, ignore them. I'm still here. We're still going to do business. And Putin was looking at this saying, are you kidding me? I just gave you your life. You were going to pay a price for it. And now you're refusing to pay? Well, I can forgive you once. I can't forgive you a second time.
You had a funny tweet that you put out, if I'm remembering correctly, something along the lines of like, this should be a Harvard Business School case study for entrepreneurial zeal and determination, because ultimately Prigozhin's coup itself was driven by a desire to save his company, to maintain control.
It was. Yeah. I mean, it was a business dispute. Like many business disputes in Russia, they end deadly. And it ultimately ended pretty badly for Evgeny Prigozhin, obviously.
So let's move now back to this comparison between Cold War I and Cold War II. So the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union emerged out of a hot war that created a power vacuum in what was at the time the center of global power, the European continent. The equivalent today is Asia. But what made that war cold wasn't just the mutual possession of nuclear weapons, which the Soviets didn't acquire until 1949, but it was also the costs imposed by World War II, the human suffering that it imposed, and the surrender of Japan and the signing of the peace treaties, the Paris peace treaties, and the desire to maintain that hard-won peace. How important are those contextual differences, the fact that the Cold Warriors of the 50s and 60s and their fellow countrymen and women had recently endured these unspeakable traumas, whereas the equivalent, quote, Cold Warriors of today are facing a much more theoretical threat?
Oh, I think it's hugely important and makes Cold War II potentially more dangerous than Cold War I, because whether you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis or the West Berlin crisis that preceded it the year earlier, you had two leaders at the time, Khrushchev and Kennedy, that have gone through not Cold War, but World War II. In Khrushchev's case, had witnessed unimaginable destruction and death. He was at Stalingrad. He was there at Stalin's side throughout much of that war. Kennedy, of course, fought in the Pacific and was wounded and lost some crew members on his PT boat. So they knew what war was like and wanted to avoid it at all costs. In fact, my good friend Sergei Radchenko, a Cold War historian that has written extensively on the Cuban Missile Crisis, writes about how when Khrushchev decided to relent and withdraw missiles from Cuba, Castro in Cuba was unbelievably livid at this and was basically encouraged him to start a nuclear war. And Khrushchev was shocked, and he was like, oh my God, this guy's insane. I'm not starting a nuclear war over Cuba because I'm not going to participate in the destruction of the civilization. Today, you have leadership, both in China and the United States, frankly, that has not gone through that experience. And in China in particular, they have not fought a war since 1979, a war that didn't go so well for them with Vietnam. And we, of course, have fought wars, but not anything on the scale of World War II since that time as well. And, I think there's too much cavalier talk about war that happens on both sides in both countries these days. And I do worry, and this book really is the ringing of the alarm bells, if you will, about us marching into this conflict that could be absolutely devastating, right? Two nuclear powers. You don't even know if that conflict would stay conventional. But even if it does, the destruction that would be inflicted on lives, on infrastructure, on the world economy is just absolutely unimaginable. And, as I said, I was early on one of the first ones to predict that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. And unfortunately, it was too late to deter that conflict. I don't think it's too late to deter this coming conflict with China. I think it is preventable, but we're running out of time.
When you say it's preventable, you mean a, quote, kinetic conflict, something that leads to casualties?
Correct. We're going to keep the Cold War. The Cold War is going to remain with us, but it doesn't ever need to go hot. And I worry a great deal that if China moves on Taiwan, that this would mean either A, devastating conflict, or really the end of American superpower, eventual end of American superpower. Because if China takes Taiwan, I think most people don't appreciate this, and I talk about this extensively in the book, the importance of Taiwan to both China and the United States. And it's not just about chips. Reducing Taiwan to chips is actually insulting to the Taiwanese and is a misunderstanding of the geopolitics of that region. But China taking Taiwan would lead to their hegemony in Asia. And a hegemony in Asia, in the most important region of the world, 50% of the world's GDP, much of the growth, and most of the supply chains, would lead to their increasing dominance around the world and a withdrawal of American power from the world, which would impact us economically, would impact our national security, and something that we've always fought against throughout our history. So the stakes here are incredibly high.
So all these are all things that we're going to discuss. I want to push back against the conclusion that you draw around the Cold Warriors of the first Cold War and the Cold Warriors of today, because it's one I've also drawn, and I'm pushing back against myself here too, because when I look back on that period, I mean, you're completely correct. John Kennedy's experience in World War II and subsequently his experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis terrified Kennedy. I mean, he became a big proponent of peace after that. But at the same time, many of his top generals, as well as the top brass within the CIA, were willing to take enormous risks with respect to instigating a nuclear war. And though I'm less familiar with the equivalent Soviet history, Khrushchev expressed similar concerns about hardliners within his own government in letters to Kennedy. So I don't know to what extent the proximity to and familiarity with war actually made many American policymakers and military planners actually more willing to go to war than they otherwise would, and that it just happened that the civilian leadership that we had was of a different persuasion. I'm curious, what do you think of that counterfactual?
No, I think you're right that it wasn't universally shared in either country, but the leadership was key, right? Ultimately, Kennedy ran the show, not the Pentagon. Khrushchev was in charge of this decision-making in the Soviet Union. And I think that mattered, right? And I think that it helped bring us back from a devastating nuclear war that could have been a civilization-ending nuclear war in those early 1960s. And, I'm not sure that we have that type of leadership in either country today.
Yeah, no, a great example is when you look at the Trump period with Kim Jong-un. That whole thing was terrifying. I mean, also another small thing just to bring up, I don't know if you saw this, and maybe I sort of overreacted to it, but when Putin invaded Ukraine, I saw a video that was popularly moving around online of like a fake Putin sort of dancing to house music with a giant cake and a big red button. And it was like a really popular video, people sort of like laughing about the prospect of nuclear war.
And by the way, we saw that with Ukraine as well, where, a number of people were saying, well, by the way, should we really be scared of Russian nuclear weapons? Maybe they don't even work, which, I assure you, they almost certainly do work.
I think the former ambassador to Moscow, didn't the former ambassador to Moscow say something like that? There was somebody who had a previous important position within the government that was making statements like that. There were a lot of people making statements like that. It was rather terrifying. So one more comparison to draw here between Cold War I and II. So I already mentioned the power vacuum that existed in Europe after the end of World War II, which was important. But so was the fact that the USSR was initially seen as a liberator at the time, in the sense that they had played a critical role in defeating the Germans and liberating Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation, which they subsequently occupied. And there were also strong communist sympathies in Europe. For example, the Italian and French communist parties controlled significant numbers of seats within their respective parliaments. So what is the comparable threat that China poses today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are differences certainly between the Soviet Union and China in that regard. The Soviet Union was intent on world revolution, certainly for the first part of the Soviet Union's involvement in the Cold War. I think it diminished significantly towards the later stages. But I don't think that China is on a sort of let's bring communism to the rest of the world warpath. I think they are interested in diminishing American power wherever they can, whether it's Africa or Latin America or the Middle East. They're going to take every opportunity to do so. And I think they are interested in building up authoritarian regimes less democratic regimes that they feel like they can more easily barter with, that they can bribe, that they can make deals with, that won't necessarily be in the interest of their populations. And that they are doing increasingly more of, particularly in Africa. There's news stories in recent years of them setting up leadership schools in Africa for future, dictators in Africa, of how you run an authoritarian country, how you do population surveillance and engage in propaganda and the like. And there you do have some similarities with the Soviet Union, different scale, different means and goals. But yes, China is interested in, for very selfish reasons, in promoting a model around the world that conflicts with ours. But I don't see that. I don't think that if you have the scenario of China invading Taiwan, that immediately you have sort of an invasion of Japan or Philippines, or not even immediately, but almost ever, because invading Japan is a very big deal, right? I mean, it would have been really, really difficult for the United States to invade Japan in 1945. We're dreading that decision. Invading it today is even tougher. I don't see China doing that. I don't see anyone else doing that, but you don't need to. And that's, I think, the key point, is that China will achieve its hegemony in Asia without that invasion. And the analogy you have to think about is really what's happening in Russia's near abroad, right? All these states in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, etc., they're basically being pulled into Russia's sphere of influence, not because they want to be there, but because they have no other choice, right? They're next to this really powerful, huge neighbor that can threaten them, as they're seeing in Ukraine, as they've seen in Georgia. And they have no alternatives. Like, the United States is far away. There's nothing we can do for them. And China is not interested in getting involved. So they have to accommodate and appease Russia, right? They're a small state sitting next to a big neighbor that is a bully. And that will be the situation in Asia, because if China takes Taiwan, they'll push the U.S. out of the Western Pacific. Our Navy will be all the way back in Guam. It will make things very, very dangerous for us, because they'll be able to put submarines on the other side of that Taiwanese coast, sensors that will make life incredibly dangerous for the U.S. Navy. And the Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, they will have to make appeasement decisions with regards to China. They're not going to cave on everything, just like Kazakhstan or Armenia does not cave to everything on Russia, but in a lot of things they will. And in fact, this is not a hypothetical. I've had those conversations with senior leaders in Japan and other places where they have told me that regardless of how, if China takes Taiwan, whether it's because we don't fight for it or we fight for it and lose, that will change everything for them. They're not going to tear up our mutual defense treaty or end trade relations with us, but they basically told me, we're going to act as if we now have a new sheriff in our neighborhood, and we're going to have to figure out a way to live with them and accommodate them in a lot greater ways than we do today. And that will have dramatic ramifications for the United States, because if China is setting the rules of global trade, of global security order, particularly in that region, it will decrease our power economically and our national security.
No, the analogy of the Caucasus and Central Asia is a good one. Another analogy you draw in the book is Berlin and Taiwan. Tell me a little bit about why you think Berlin is a good analogy for what the United States could be facing in the event of a Chinese uncontested invasion of Taiwan.
So this is remarkable, right? And during the Cold War history, people focused so much on Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was certainly an incredibly dangerous time, but it was just 13 days in that fateful October of 1962. And what people often forget is the West Berlin crisis that occurred a year earlier in 1961. It occurred right after the meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, where Kennedy came away convinced that Khrushchev was going to invade West Berlin, right? Khrushchev was threatening it at the time. And Kennedy made the fateful decision that this was going to be an existential issue for the United States. He went on television at the time in that summer and basically told Americans that we are going to fight for West Berlin, this outpost of freedom and democracy surrounded by East Germany and Soviet troops, right? Really, really difficult place to fight for. And he made the case that this was existential to the United States interests. And he warned the American public of a potential for a nuclear war over West Berlin that he was willing to engage in, right? That's how high the stakes were in his mind over West Berlin. And in fact, the duck and cover drills, the bomb shelter mania that we saw in the 1960s due to the threat of nuclear war started from that episode. It didn't start from the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It began much earlier. So we managed to deter that invasion. And I write in the book that there's this amazing episode at the end of that summer when Kennedy is woken up and he's been told that the East Germans are building the wall. And he says, thank God. He sighs in relief, right? What a change to 20 years later, President Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And Kennedy celebrates it at the time because he says, if they're building the wall, they're not invading. And we have just pulled back from the brink of war. And in fact, yes, it was a year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was really an outgrowth of the West Berlin crisis, as we now know. But after that, the relationship between the United States and Soviet Union stabilized. We got detente in the 1970s. We pulled back from the brink of war. The Cold War remained, and we had proxy wars in Vietnam and conflicts in Africa that we supported and they supported in Central America and the like. But the dangers of us going to war, and particularly nuclear war, diminished dramatically. And I write in the book that is the situation with Taiwan. That if we build sort of a metaphorical wall across the Taiwan Straits, if we deter the invasion of Taiwan by China, the Cold War will not go away. The conflicts we face with China, economic conflicts and strategic disagreements about the security order that they want to displace will remain. But the threat of war will diminish dramatically, and we can stabilize the relationship. We can potentially even get to a detente that Neil Ferguson talks about. But you can't do that as long as this sword of Damocles is hanging over Taiwan and as China is preparing to take that island by force.
So, Dimitri, I'm going to move us to the second hour of this conversation. There's so much more to discuss. I want to drill down a little bit more into the importance of Taiwan to understand why you think it's so important. And also, I mean, it's obvious here as we're talking that the key is deterrence, because if we knew it for a fact that U.S. support for Taiwan would lead to a nuclear exchange, we would just let the Chinese have it. But we don't know that, and so we're trying to do our best to deter that possibility. I assume you agree with that.
No, absolutely. I mean, you really have three possibilities here, right? And only three. That A, China is deterred from invasion, the Goldilocks scenario, or China is not deterred and they move forward and they either lose or they win. And I would argue that those two latter alternatives are going to be an absolute disaster for us, for China, for Taiwan, for the world, right? Win or lose. Obviously, it's better to win, but even if they lose, I mean, it's better for us to win, but even if the Chinese lose the invasion and we win, it's going to be an absolute disaster in terms of lives lost, destruction of the world economy, decimation of the U.S. Navy in that region. Really, really terrible outcome. So we have to do whatever it takes to make sure they never even try. I write in the book that we have to make sure our policy needs to be to make sure that President Xi is waking up every single day, and as he's looking at himself in the mirror, he's saying, today is not the day.
Yeah. I mean, no, that's a really great way of thinking about it. And you know, this is something that, to go back to the point about numbers 2 and 3 being unacceptable, this is something that John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev understood, that the consequences of fighting a nuclear war are so devastating that it should just never even come as a possibility. You should just do everything you can to remove that from happening. So this is something I want to talk about. I also want to talk about what it is that we're fighting for here, because I feel like a lot of Americans, and myself included, are a little confused about that. And how important is it that we communicate that clearly and in a credible way, not just to our allies, but also to our citizens? Because in America today, you know, I grew up in an America where the vast majority of Americans did not want to burn down the system. That's no longer true. There is a significant number of people who believe that the system is so rotten and corrupt that they just want to burn it the F down. This is a rallying cry. And this is not a place from which to project strength. And I feel like we have not done enough to strengthen our own country and to build a coalition of people that understand and support the kind of foreign policy that we're describing here. So this is something else I want to talk about. And perhaps we'll also have a chance to talk about some of the contemporary issues that are happening in the world today. The most important issue right now, for example, is what's going on between Israel and Iran. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Dimitri, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Dimitri, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.